When people think about medieval battles, they usually imagine archers firing a few volleys and then running out of arrows. But that is not how war in medieval Europe usually worked. Armies prepared for long campaigns, stocked huge numbers of arrows in advance, moved supplies with the army, and even collected arrows from the field when possible. To understand how they kept shooting, you have to look at the system behind the battle, not just the men holding the bows. Number 1. The real question. Medieval armies did run out of arrows sometimes, and that is the first thing worth getting straight. The reason they did not run out in the way people imagine is that an archer's personal supply was never the whole system. What a man carried on his body, or kept right beside him once the line was formed, was only the first layer. Behind that was the baggage train, the campaign stockpile, the workshop network that had been producing arrows for months, and the officials or local authorities who had already been told exactly how many bows and sheaves had to be ready. So the real question is not why medieval soldiers had endless arrows. They did not. The real question is why the flow of arrows could last long enough to shape a battle. In medieval Europe, especially in England during the age of the longbow, the answer was planning. The bow itself mattered, but the bigger story was organization. An army that wanted missile fire had to think about wood, iron or steel, transport, storage, inspection, and timing long before the first shot was fired. Once you look at it that way, the picture changes. A medieval battle was not just men showing up with weapons. It was a supply operation moving with an army. The arrows in the air were only the visible end of a long chain. That is why armies did not rely on a single quiver and hope for the best. They relied on layers of supply, and those layers were built in advance. Number 2. More than a quiver. One reason modern audiences get the wrong idea is that films turn ammunition into a backpack problem. In real medieval warfare, it was a campaign problem. English records from the 14th century show crown officials ordering arrows in very large batches. In 1341, the Sheriff of York was ordered to buy 500 white bows and 500 sheaves of arrows and get them to the port of Orwell for the King's War with France. A few years later, in 1359, Lincoln was ordered to provide 1,000 sheaves of arrows. In 1368, Northampton was ordered to provide 600 sheaves made from seasoned wood and fitted with steel heads to be delivered to the Tower of London. In 1369, London and Middlesex were ordered to provide another 1,000 sheaves, again of good seasoned wood and with steel heads, and the language of the order makes the point very clearly. This was urgent state business, not a casual purchase. In 1371, York was told to provide 1,000 more sheaves on top of earlier orders. That alone tells you a lot. Medieval governments were not counting arrows one soldier at a time. They were counting them by the hundreds and thousands of bundled missiles, moving them through ports, county networks, and central stores. The archer at the front saw only his immediate ammunition. The army behind him had already invested in a much larger reserve. Even one county example makes the scale easy to picture. Essex was required in 1346 to send 200 archers, 160 bows, and 400 sheaves of arrows, along with hurdles, gangways, boards, and empty tons for water. In other words, arrows moved with the rest of campaign logistics. They were part of the same transport system as engineering materials and basic supplies. That is why a medieval army could keep shooting after the first few minutes. The bowman's own load was only the opening amount. The real supply sat behind the line, in wagons, in carts, in ships, and in depots prepared before the campaign even began. Number 3. Built before battle. That brings us to the next point.
Arrows were not quick little sticks that could be thrown together the night before a fight. A military arrow had to be made in quantity, but it also had to be good enough to survive handling, transport, and release from a heavy bow. That is why the written records keep returning to quality control. The English crown repeatedly demanded seasoned wood rather than green wood, and it insisted on hard or steel heads. In one order, officials were even told to fit the arrows with steel heads, made to the pattern of an iron sample, supplied on the king's behalf. That sounds almost modern. It means the government was not just buying some arrows. It was trying to standardize what kind of war arrow it wanted. London's fletchers were also regulated. In 1385, the Mayor of London was ordered to make sure arrows sold there were made of good and sufficient wood, properly feathered, and with heads that were good and hard. In 1403, the city's ordinance for the trade gave wardens the power to inspect arrows, heads, and quarrels, seize false work, and destroy it. They were specifically told to search for arrows and bolts made of good and dry wood, with hard heads, because bad workmanship meant danger to the king and the realm. This matters for the supply question, because numbers alone were not enough. A badly made arrow wasted money, space, and transport. A warped shaft or poor head weakened the whole missile arm of an army. So, when medieval rulers stockpiled arrows, they also tried to control manufacture. They needed a reliable product, not just a large pile. The result was that ammunition supply was partly solved in the workshop and the marketplace, before it was solved on the battlefield. Armies did not avoid running out just by carrying more. They avoided it by creating an arrow industry that could keep producing usable military ammunition at scale. Number 4. Fire in bursts.
Another reason armies did not burn through ammunition as fast as people expect is simple. Real shooting rates were lower and more controlled than the image most people carry in their heads. English heritage notes that a powerful medieval longbow could shoot at least 6 arrows a minute and had a range of well over 200 meters. That is serious firepower, but it is not the same as non-stop maximum speed shooting for long stretches. Heavy war bows were physically demanding. Their success depended on strength and training, and medieval archers practiced from early boyhood because that strength could not be improvised. England even pushed archery through law. In 1388, legislation told servants and laborers to stop playing certain games and practice archery instead, because the defense of the realm depended on it. That tells you 2 things at once. First, effective archery needed a trained population. Second, governments understood that missile warfare was only as strong as the system feeding men into it. But even trained men did not simply empty every arrow the moment a fight began. Commanders had every reason to hold fire until range, terrain, and target density made it worth the cost. Shooting too early wasted arrows. Shooting flat out for too long exhausted archers. So the best use of arrows was usually controlled pressure, not reckless speed. That matters a lot for the supply question. If a bowman can lose 6 arrows a minute, it still does not follow that he will do that continuously from start to finish. Missile fire usually came in bursts, adjusted to distance and opportunity. Crossbows make the same point from the other direction. The Metropolitan Museum notes that the crossbow was the most widely used missile weapon across medieval Europe, but it shot more slowly than the longbow because it had to be spanned mechanically. Slower rate of fire meant lower short-term ammunition burn. So whether an army leaned toward longbows in England or crossbows on much of the continent, discipline and practical rate of fire stretched the supply further than modern viewers often assume. Number 5. Prepared ground. Medieval armies also kept their arrow supply effective, by choosing the kind of battle that made every shot count. A missile arm works best when the enemy has to come to it, not when archers are forced to move fast, break formation, or loose in panic. English armies learned this very well in the 14th and 15th centuries. The longbow was strongest from a chosen position, and artificial obstacles could make that position much harder to overrun. Britannica notes that bowmen in major English victories used stakes or other obstacles to break up cavalry and slow attackers. At Agincourt, sharpened stakes in front of the archers helped stop mounted attacks from rolling straight through the line. That kind of preparation mattered for ammunition as much as for defense. When the enemy had to advance through mud, narrow ground, or obstacles, the archers did not need to waste arrows guessing at long range or shooting while retreating. They could wait, hold formation, and begin when the target was where it needed to be. That turns the same bundle of arrows into a much more effective resource. It also helps explain why longbowmen were dangerous in some battles and far less impressive when caught unprepared. A bow is not just a weapon. In medieval field warfare, it is part of a position. If the position is right, the arrows go further in a practical sense because more of them are spent at useful moments. The same logic applied in sieges and defensive warfare across Europe. A wall, a gatehouse, a rampart, or a fixed urban defense made resupply easier because the missiles could be stored close to the firing point. The Met notes that oversized crossbows on castle walls could be spanned with windlasses and other heavy systems that were not practical in the open field. So, one answer to the ammunition question is terrain.
Medieval armies and garrisons tried to fight in ways that made the first stock of arrows last longer, not because the missiles were infinite, but because the battlefield was arranged to use them efficiently. Number 6. Stored and recovered. There is another part of the story that often gets missed. Not every arrow vanished forever the moment it was shot. Some were lost, some broke, some stuck deep, some were trampled, but others could be recovered. That mattered both during and after a fight. The best-known battlefield example comes from Towton in 1461. Later accounts describe Yorkist archers letting the Lancastrians shoot into the wind, watching many of those arrows fall short, and then stepping forward to pick them up and send them back. Whether every detail of the story is taken literally or not, the basic point is sound. Arrows on a medieval battlefield were physical objects lying on the ground, lodged in soft earth, caught in shields, or resting short of the target. They were not all vaporized on impact. Recovery, therefore, formed part of the economy of ammunition. The same was true away from the battlefield. Heads could be made, inspected, replaced, or reforged. Shafts and finished arrows were goods that could be counted, stored, checked, and moved from one place to another. Later records still talk about massive quantities of arrows held in ordnance stores, which shows that governments treated them as inventory, not as an afterthought. Even when missiles were damaged, the system behind them did not disappear. Craftsmen could repair some items, authorities could reorder more, and armies could gather usable arrows after a clash or a siege. None of that means recovery solved the problem by itself. It did not. But it made a difference at the margins, and medieval warfare often turned on margins. If part of the spent ammunition could be collected, sorted, and reused, then the line between running low and still able to shoot moved a little further away.
The supply of arrows was never just about production. It was also about how carefully armies handled the missiles they already had. Number 7. England and the continent. England gets most of the attention in modern discussions because the longbow became central to its war-making in the 100 Years' War. But the bigger European picture matters too.
The Met points out that throughout the Middle Ages, the crossbow was the most widely used missile weapon in Europe, even if the English longbow later took on a larger place in popular memory. That wider use helps explain why so many medieval societies had built institutions around missile weapons. In continental Europe, especially in towns and cities, crossbows were not just private gear. The Met's research on European crossbows shows that many urban communities required inhabitants to maintain arms and armor, while additional crossbows were stored in urban arsenals and kept in working order by city-paid makers. Practice was often supported by city councils, and in many places even made compulsory. Over time, those routines helped create crossbow associations and shooting societies, especially in France, the Low Countries, and the German-speaking regions. This is important because it shows that medieval Europe solved the ammunition problem in more than one way. England leaned hard on a trained archer population and large state purchases for overseas war. Many continental towns leaned on urban arsenals, civic obligation, and easier-to-train crossbowmen for local defense, feuds, and regional campaigns. The exact weapon was different, but the principle was the same. Missile warfare stayed useful only when there was an institution behind it. Someone had to store the weapons, pay the craftsmen, inspect the gear, support practice, and replace losses. So when people ask how medieval armies did not run out of arrows, the answer is not because bows were simple. The answer is that Europe built systems around missile weapons.
The longbow in England and the crossbow in much of the rest of Europe both sat inside organized military cultures. And those cultures treated ammunition as something that had to be planned, paid for, and managed. Number 8. When supply failed. The clearest way to understand all of this is to look at the opposite case. Medieval missile troops looked overwhelming when the system held together, but much less impressive when it did not. If transport lagged, if a campaign dragged on, if weather damaged materials, if officials failed to meet quotas, if archers were forced into battle before the ground was prepared, or if commanders wasted ammunition at the wrong range, the weakness showed immediately. That is why the records are full of urgency, threats, inspections, and repeated orders. Kings did not talk that way because arrows were easy to replace. They talked that way because they knew arrows were essential and shortages were dangerous. The same logic explains why governments kept returning to practice laws and trade controls. A bow without a trained man was not enough. A trained man without good arrows was not enough. Good arrows without transport were not enough. Medieval armies did not avoid running out because the weapon itself somehow solved the problem. They avoided it when production, storage, transport, training, and tactics all worked together. And when one of those pieces failed, the image of endless arrow fire disappeared very quickly. Medieval Europe did not have magical ammunition. Missile troops kept shooting only when production, storage, transport, training, and tactics were all working together. Once one of those links failed, the famous storm of arrows could shrink very fast, and the bow was reduced to whatever ammunition was left on the field or in the baggage behind the line.